Hey everyone, Professor Snar checking in again here as we enter day 2 of our course. Feels like midterm practically. Things are a little hectic always at the start of classes, but I think the 5-week session makes it even more so. So I just want to check in. We'll look at some due dates here. The introductions unit, which is unit 1, is due today, which is Wednesday, May 30th. And then we get into our next couple of units, units 2 and 3, which are both due Friday, June 1st. So as far as the introductions, pretty straightforward. Just going to click myself in. 2 basic components here, creating your home page. Be sure you have a picture that's in there that's showing up as a picture that's sized right for the page. And then a brief welcome discussion. Again, the only thing here to make sure you've got is reply to other students' posts. So those are the basic kind of technical things to make sure you have going right, to make sure you get full credit for these, and they're really pretty easy, so it's kind of free money right off the bat. We move then into a couple of units that are separate but related, so it makes sense actually to have them here in the course right as we get going, but also maybe do on the same day. That's practically useful just because of our compressed time period, but both units have to do with kind of the notion of like where poems come from. So the first one, Finding the Poem, has us doing some reading in the textbook, and also then a couple of discussion board assignments that really are questions of how you work or think as a writer. And as with a lot of what we talk about, there's no necessarily like right, correct way versus a wrong way. It's really more ultimately about being conscious and intentional when it comes to choices that you're making about the writing that you're doing, the subjects you pick, and really working like a writer, and not just like if a poem happened or an idea happens to come to you, then great. If not, that usually works for the rest of our lives, but part of the challenge of this course, but also part of why these courses are useful for writers, is that you really are forced to produce work, which can honestly be one of the hardest parts of being a poet. I mean, certainly you're not a poet by profession, but to declare yourself a writer, I mean, God, who doesn't do that? Everyone's a guitar player too, but very few of us are actually writers for publication or play in bands or that kind of thing, or have some, facility with these hobbies. And so that's kind of the mantle you want to pick up for at least these 5 weeks, if not really longer into your writing career, even if writing is just a hobby for you, but to always be sort of conscious of this being a part of who you are, and so you need to make it an intentional, conscious, willful part of things that you do. So part of what we want to think about then right off the bat is not so much even how to write a poem, but just where they come from. How to begin developing ideas, even if it's something as simple as, getting in the habit of keeping a notebook where you just jot interesting, not just ideas even, but interesting phrases. You run across a word that just seems unusual. You walk around the corner and there's a sort of image of weird stuff happening, like 2 things that just shouldn't be happening at the same place, neither of which are individually that interesting, but together they just kind of strike you, even if you can't say why exactly. Getting into the habit of just kind of noticing those things and realizing that anything around us can be the stuff of a poem, maybe even a great poem after it's worked up and worked on a little bit. So that's part of what Unit 2 gets us into, and then Unit 3 is actually one of my favorites because it introduces us to a great poet, but also a great critic or a thinker about poetry, T.S. Eliot, who most people know from works like Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and his much more epic The Wasteland, which lots of people know about, but few people have actually read. We're interested here in an essay of his called Tradition and the Individual Talent, and it is quite literally what the title suggests. It is Eliot kind of theorizing about what's the relationship between the individual poet and the long literary tradition before him or her. But the part that we're more particularly interested within this longer essay is really his discussion about the poetic mind, or the mind of the poet, and how it works. So sort of how poems can be formulated. And this is one theory among lots, of course. So I'm not presenting this as correct, whereas others are incorrect, but it's one that makes a lot of sense to me. And the neat part of this unit is that the basic idea actually gets reconfigured in so many different kind of surprising places. So I had this relatively contemporary commercial, a couple of years old, I think, for HP products, Hewlett-Packard. I'm not even sure what the thing is for exactly. And it features Gwen Stefani, who people know from No Doubt or her own solo music career. And clearly she doesn't write the commercial, so it's not like she says this off the top of her head, but she might embrace this theory of creativity. But certainly someone behind the marketing campaign wanted to put forward this theory of how art ends up being this kind of mashup or this conglomeration of things, which is almost identical in some ways to what Eliot has to say about where poems come from. So it's really interesting, even if you don't subscribe to the ideas, although I think, again, like I said, I think they're correct in as much as these things can be correct. They certainly are food for thought for where we want to be right now in terms of thinking about where do poems come from? How do we view the world as poets or as writers such that we're not just kind of waiting for some magical thing to happen, but we're consciously looking and seizing and storing up these things so that that moment can occur in a more meaningful kind of way. So the theories put forth here are an interesting combination of activity on the part of the artist, but also passivity. So it's not so much that we can either force poems to happen or art of any kind, nor can we just sit idly by and wait for something to appear on the page, but it's some mixture of how the mind works. Again, in Eliot's formulation is really interesting, that often we work to collect these images, ideas, phrases, individual words, little knickknacks of language, and it's not until one, in and of itself, that's not particularly interesting necessarily, it's not till that one that comes into contact with all the others that each one of them all of a sudden takes on this kind of comprehensive sense that none of that hodgepodge had before. So again, great food for thought, and I think a sort of theory of the poetic mind that makes a lot of sense for us as we start our course here. So be aware of those due dates. Make sure you give yourself enough time to really do these discussion boards. Well, don't necessarily just go in and try to type it all at once if you want to work in a Word document to make editing a little bit easier, or so you're not sort of locked into a one time period kind of a thing. You can always cut and paste once you're done with that, but be sure to keep up with those due dates. And be in touch with me if you have any questions. Really don't hesitate on that, especially because of our compressed time here. If you run into, whether it's a technical issue, just a question about a reading or a requirement or just whatever, be in touch right away and I'll get right back to you.